What do you think about the influence of Russia on UK politics over the past 15 years?
Yeah, okay. I thought that one might come up. Um, Lord, where to start? Sorry, I should have said at the beginning, I was the UK ambassador in Moscow from 2016 to 20. So, during the period where some of this was quite actively under debate. Um, what can I usefully say? The the Russians would certainly like to influence politics in the UK, in Western Europe, in the US, and elsewhere. This is part of what I was briefly summarizing of how they conduct cognitive warfare. And all the usual techniques of so many of them going back to the KGB and all the rest of it. I tend to keep an open mind on how successful they've been. So certainly a lot of effort has been put in, and over the years, some of the details of that have emerged, including the things that they're good at, like buying the occasional politician and making sure that they're putting resource into shaping the narrative. But there is another part of this, which is about whatever we think of how successful it is, whose fault is it? Whose responsibility is it? So the way I tend to put it is that when the Russian state systematically uses the tools of subversion, misinformation, disinformation, propaganda, all the rest of it, and they're all documented. I mean, you can find loads and loads of material on this. They do it because more often than not, it works. And it works because we allow it to work. So whose fault is that? If it troubles us, we need to do something about it. And the things that I always come back to is, the point about things like propaganda and about the point of contact between propaganda and particularly populist politics is that they exploit grievances. So there's a proper political debate to be had there about what the nature of those grievances are, how they came about, how you address them. But I think we need to remind ourselves sometimes that things like anger and resentment and jealousy and fear are very, very powerful motivators in politics, as in just ordinary life. And if an opponent is seeking to exploit those things, why would you expect them to do anything different?
I mean, it seems that we've been very naive in our approach to our press and our social media regulation. Do you think that the famous Russia report will ever be released?
Uh, an unclassified version of the thing, of course, was released at the time.
Mm.
The fully classified version, no, I'd be amazed if it's ever released. But that's not something for an official or a former official, to determine. I mean, now in 2026, I think the most important point is to come back to is not so much things that were going on 10 years ago, but things that are going on right now. Why is it that I did a broadcast last week on one of the national outlets on the day that the report came in that Alexei Navalny, the political prisoner, had been killed with epibetadine, a poison derived from a frog. If you study Russia, this hardly comes as a surprise. A, that they kill somebody in prison. Well, who knew? And second, that they tend, that there's a kind of default to doing it in these very, very exotic ways on the grounds that they're almost certainly untraceable, and even if they are, it's so far-fetched that a lot of people will just disbelieve it. And the point I was making there is that I really hesitate to recommend anybody to spend much time on Twitter or X, but if you do, you can watch this playing out literally in real time. If you know what you're looking for, if you know the techniques you're looking for, the bots and the trolls and the useful idiots and all the rest of it, it's all there. You just need to look at it happening. If you go to the readers' comments sections in the national press, it's all there. And what do you do about it? Well, it's very, very easy to identify the problem. It's much harder systematically to address it because apart from anything else, amongst other things, there's a sort of generational change going on in how people consume news and current affairs. I think certainly people of my generation really find it hard to sort of catch up with that. But there are also more other things in there. Something I'm following very, very closely for the moment is the debate around, for example, the BBC Charter renewal. So I spent most of my career working either on or in authoritarian states or failed states. And when you do that, you know what the absence of sound public interest institutions looks like. You also know how difficult they are to build and how easy it is to destroy them. So you can take from that what you will about my own views on the matter, but in a world where we do not cultivate trusted in institutions, we're going to get what we deserve.
Well, that's quite a depressing thought.
I'm trying to maybe turn it round. I mean, so it's a call for action. What do we do, rather than just watch it happen?
It seems that public policy is light years behind, what's actually happening on the ground. I mean, young people are getting their news from YouTube, which is hopefully where this will end up. But yeah, they're not too concerned about who's producing the news, which is quite worrying. Are you encouraged at all by reports that Ukraine is doing a bit better at the moment and striking Russia, catching it off guard behind the lines?
Up to a point, yes. The effect of Ukrainian deep strikes into Russia. I mean, first of all, it's important to distinguish between what Ukraine is trying to do and what Russia is doing. In the case of Russia, this is systematic obliteration of civilian infrastructure. So we saw in the last couple of months, it's pretty much an attempt to freeze the population into submission. Winter is cold in that part of the world, -20 cold, and if there's no heating, no water, no sanitation, no nothing, then Russia is doing that to try to break the will of the population. In the case of Ukrainian deep strike into Russia, it's essentially against the defense infrastructure, so the ability to manufacture and deploy military force into Ukraine. They're two very different things. At one level, the effect of successful Ukrainian strikes over time is to make it more difficult for Russia to do what they're doing in Ukraine. So this has been the story all along as different weapons systems have been introduced. None of them will individually determine the outcome of the war, but what they do is make it harder, riskier, more costly to Russia to prosecute the invasion of Ukraine. The problem, though, is that I don't think any of this will decisively turn the war in Ukraine's favor. Unless Russia economically or politically collapses, which I think is highly unlikely, at least in the short to medium term, it won't change Putin's policy goals, his strategic goals in Ukraine. What I think it is the right way to think about it is it increases the pressure on Putin, to go for that ceasefire. I mean, I think probably the right way to think about this now is not just in terms of this year or next year, but how to create the conditions so that when Putin leaves office, which I think is when he dies, the Russian leadership has to have a wholesale reassessment of its goals, not only in Ukraine, but its approach towards us. And at that point, I think there's at least a reasonable chance of some kind of de-escalation. But it's a very, very unpromising outlook in terms of a ceasefire is probably the best you can get. I don't think the underlying conflict will be resolved while Putin's alive.
I've got one last question, which is there are elections coming up in Hungary and the possibility that Orban might actually be unseated. And Hungary's been a key kind of block on what the support that the Europeans have been able to give. Do you see any optimistic signs there?
It's important. I mean, there are usually workarounds for a small country standing in the way of what the majority wants to do, whether it's in the European Union or in NATO. What it does, though, is sort of increase the cost and decrease the effectiveness of what you're trying to achieve. And of course, it hands a giant lever to Putin to keep wedge driving and trying to open up those differences. So far, pretty successfully. Well, the thing that I find fascinating about all of this is that countries that have a living memory of being invaded by Moscow don't seem to see the connection. So it goes back to something I was saying earlier about the divisions within the alliance and within Europe, as well as within our own societies, about what we think this is actually about. I spent the best part of 8 years living in Putin's Russia, and worked on it outside for a number of years beyond that. It's not it's not difficult to see what it is, but there are people who seem not to.
No, I just find it fascinating that so many people on the left still think of Putin and Russia as somehow something that represents a left-wing ideology when it's clearly what is it, Tim Schneider's thing about it's a what does he call it, Russo-fascism or something to that effect.
There are lots of words used to describe it. It's not just the left though. It's the populist right.
Yeah.
A lot of it, in my experience, is also people who don't necessarily think of Russia in terms of left or right, but it's about resentment of things in their own country, their own world, their own life. This is, I think, why it's so important when thinking about propaganda, disinformation, cognitive warfare, to understand the things that it latches onto. It doesn't latch onto arguments and facts. It latches onto anger and emotions, and mostly negative emotions. And I think one of the problems in our own politics is that we've been very, very slow to wake up to that, and even slower to work out what are the effective responses to it.
Yeah, Brexit being an example. Yeah.
Well, if you turn it back onto Russia, I mean, there's this whole sort of ideology being built around variously Great Russia, the Russian world, the sort of last bastion of sort of Christian nationalism, whichever iteration we're talking about at the moment. But the way that Russia really works, it's a nexus of power, money, and violence. That's how Russia works.
I'm just curious about how important you think the coalition of the willing, as it's been named, is in terms of helping to shape Trump's response. Do we underestimate, because I was listening to something earlier on the news agents, do we overestimate Trump and his bullishness and actually underestimate our power to say, no, Trump, you're not doing that, as was evidenced with Greenland?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, and it's got more than one sort of facet to it, I think. So, I mean, first of all, what we've seen just seriatim over the last year is that Witkoff and Kushner and one or two others go and do their stuff, with the Russian representatives, and something entirely predictable comes back, which is a deal that it would be fundamentally harmful to both Ukraine and to Europe if it was implemented, assuming it's even implementable. And what then happens is a great deal of diplomacy, including some really creative stuff by both the UK and some of the Europeans as well, to try and pull that back into something that might actually conceivably make sense. And one of the problems, of course, in all of this is that it's trying to get inside the skin of what Mr. Trump thinks the United States' interests are in all of this. And the conclusion I've come to on that, I mean, this is a sort of gross oversimplification. He doesn't care about Ukraine. He personally dislikes Zelensky. There's history there around the first term and Hunter Biden and all the rest of it, and Zelensky saying no when asked to dish the dirt on Biden's son. He obviously clearly considers the Europeans to be, for the most part, freeloaders in terms of their own security. And he's not the first person to say that in the US system. I mean, if we had more time, we could explain, we could discuss why things were the way they were, particularly during the Cold War. But the underlying point there comes back to the now urgent need for a rebalancing in the transatlantic security relationship. There's a more troubling thing in there, which I touched on in my remarks, which is about how Trump understands Putin. I think he thinks that Putin is a man a bit like Trump, who's motivated by similar things and wants similar things. He is absolutely wrong. Mr. Putin's entire formative experiences are KGB in the late Cold War and the humiliations of the 1990s. This is not a cooperative relationship that he's looking for with the US. It's about reestablishing Russia as one of the top three global great powers. That is at the expense of the United States and its allies. So there are other aspects to this also about how you would go about supporting a ceasefire if we got there and securing Europe over the longer term. And that there's a degree of, I think, unreality in some of the discussions going on, in that, I mean, obviously, a coalition is what you reach for when, for the UK, you're not part of the European Union, where NATO may be member states, you don't want to get involved. And there are others from outside the system who may want to help. But the idea that you can pull together a peacekeeping force, a peace enforcement force, involving NATO forces or forces from NATO countries with boots on the ground in Ukraine, there is zero prospect that Putin will ever agree to that. That's part of, in his view, what the war is about. So what follows from that is that if that's the route you're going down, you better mean it. And in turn, that means you really, really need to have the proper bankable backing of the United States, and Mr. Putin needs to believe that. Right.
So Chris Johnson's thing about having peacekeeping troops on the ground, as he was saying this weekend, is absolute no-no.
It's always an option, but before going down that route, you need to understand the size of the risks you're taking.
What Putin has actually achieved is NATO has actually grown, and the European Union's looking quite a lot stronger, and lots of people are queuing up to join, possibly including ourselves. So has he actually made it backfire on himself?
It's been a strategic catastrophe. Start to finish. I mean, the whole idea was a terrible idea, and it tells you something about the nature of any authoritarian state, but that particular authoritarian state. That you remember the meeting of the Security Council just before the invasion? They're all gathered in one of those huge ornate Kremlin halls. There's Putin behind a slightly undersized desk, and all of the Security Council, these really, really senior, quite odd people sitting on chairs like school children, and he's making them one after the other stand up and support the thing that he's about to do. One of them is so terrified that he can't even get his lines right. He's the head of the SVR, the External Intelligence Service, Naryshkin. I mean, he's not a shrinking violet, but he's so terrified to tell Putin what Putin doesn't want to hear that he keeps fluffing his lines. So I mean, what to say about that? I mean, there's maybe to turn that back to ourselves. There's something in there about, I now work in a university. What are universities for? They're about teaching people how to think clearly and seriously, how to disagree effectively, how to disagree well, and then how to decide, what they think needs to be done and do it. But that's part of what I mean by the power of institutions. And one of the problems of Russia is that all the institutions are hollowed out, so that even when you have really powerful people sitting on top of vast numbers of staff and all the rest of it, the institution itself just isn't there. It's just the will of the people at the top of them that prevails. There's nobody able to say, you know what, this is a really, really bad idea.
I just was wondering what you made of. Is there any substance to this board of peace, and what's the intent behind it? If there is an intent or substance to it.
My honest view on the board of peace, you can take the sort of boy out of the Foreign Office, but you can't take the Foreign Office out of the boy. It's possible that it might, under some circumstances, do something useful. I would maybe say no more than that. But what it looks like to me, to be honest, is another variant of theatre with an audience of one, where the audience is Donald Trump.